we come to the culmination of a set of presentations, 13, that constitute an ancient wisdom, progression, and tradition. In Alexandria, towards the end of the 1st century AD, the 13-part series was established by the Hermetica, from the Poimandres, the creative mind shepherd, to the rebirth. 13 in a set of dialogues, and the earliest sets of dialogues were done by Plato in his academy, which he founded in Athens in 387 BC at the age of 40. The Platonic dialogues are able to be grouped into sets, but the sets rarely exceed 4 or 3 or a pair, and sometimes 1. And the reason for that stepping of sets is that Plato based himself on Pythagoras. And the Pythagorean symbol was always 10 dots arranged in a pyramid, in a triangle, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that symbol, that Pythagorean symbol, was learned by Pythagoras in Egypt. And the place in Egypt that he learned it was Heliopolis. In the Bible, the Old Testament, it's called On, but its name was Heliopolis. And it had the temple to the sun, to Ra, whose reoccurrence was the epitome of keeping track of time into eternity. And what was interesting is that Heliopolis not only had the temple to the sun, but the temple was surrounded by a wisdom school that had been there at that time for several thousand years. One of the qualities that made it extraordinary is that when we look at the Old Testament, at the first book in the Torah, Genesis, we're able to read and understand that from Abraham through Isaac to Jacob to the 11th of the 12 sons of Jacob, whose name was Joseph, that Egypt figured prominently for Abraham and for Joseph, and that Joseph was actually rose to the second most powerful position in Egypt, and actually was the overseer of Egypt for a whole generation. That 7 lean years followed the 7 fat years, which he had stored foods, material, and was able to get Egypt through the difficulties. What is interesting to us is that Joseph married an Egyptian woman named Asenath, and Asenath was the daughter of the chief priest of Heliopolis. What is significant is that Moses, in recounting this, recounts that Joseph was put in charge of making sure that his father, Jacob, was buried in the promised land, and that his will included that he be buried there too. And in that province called Samaria, under Mount Gerizim, there is Jacob's well, and there is also Joseph's tomb. but the bones were taken after the Exodus and carried all the way back and buried there. It was actually Joshua who saw to it that this was done. 2 of the 12 tribes became the 2 sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And what we're given to understand in this is that there is no way that Jacob's sons could have inherited primordial positions as 2 of the 12 tribes unless their mother was Jewish. And the only way that that happens is that Asenath, the daughter of the chief priest of Heliopolis, was Jewish, which meant that her mother was Jewish. So that there is a long, deep resonance of there being wisdom traditions that are Egyptian, but at the same time have primordially influenced Judaism. Another aspect, Joseph lived in the 1600s BC. He was born sometime in the late 1700s BC. The time between Joseph and Moses was about 400 years. So that the Jewish tradition at its origins, with Abraham all the way through to Joseph, gave a special wisdom position, the highest wisdom position in Egyptian civilization, and was at the root of the transformation of an earlier Semitic general tradition to the specific Jewish patriarchal tradition. And what we're given to understand here is that there is a confluence of 2 different qualities. The original Semitic quality is from the land of the 2 rivers from Mesopotamia. It goes back to Sumerian times, it goes back to Akkadian times, which meant that the Semitic matrix out of which Judaism came was definitely a Mesopotamian aspect, and that the Egyptian was different from it. But the Mesopotamian was not only the land of the 2 rivers, it was in the center of an extended empire that stretched from India to the Aegean, to the island of Cyprus, and extended beyond with contacts to Crete and to Rhodes. Egypt did not have that kind of extension, and the easy way to remember the extension is the Fertile Crescent from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. But the Fertile Crescent is within a field, a celestial field that extends all the way to India from the Aegean. Egypt, on the other hand, is like a pointer pointing to that Fertile Crescent, that larger spread, because Egypt has its roots in Africa. And so it is the African roots of Egyptian civilization, the characteristic quality where what happens in an African wisdom tradition, it is the subtle, rhythmic, gesturing, moving, dancing that carries the refinement of the wisdom learning. Whereas in the Mesopotamian, it is definitely in a different kind of a registry. That registry is not in movement so much, but in the order of things. This means that there were two different qualities to wisdom traditions that came down through the ages. We have seen with Hermetic America that our heritage in the past 300 years, really going back almost 400 years, has an African and a European derived from the ancient Near East quality of its context and background. We've also seen that the way in which this played out was in the frontier movement to the West. And it's this frontier movement that gives us a key to the primordial wisdom inheritance of our kind, of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens. Our species is a refinement of Homo sapiens. And we are now undergoing the culmination of a second refinement of our species to Homo sapiens stellaris, as I name it, star wisdom man. The children who are here already are remarkably different from children from even 25, 35 years ago. They are different in the sense that they have a multifaceted agility that is seemingly natural to them, whereas it was extraordinary just 2 generations ago, and it was extremely rare a century ago. Now it's almost every young child that you see has a refinement, a species refinement that has been prepared for a very long time. One of the characteristics of a wisdom tradition, both African-based, Egyptian, and the Mesopotamian stretching from India to the Aegean, is that one in a wisdom learning goes through stages, and that these stages can be arranged so that the motion of your going through the stages creates not a coming to a stage so much, but as passing through a gate. And so one of the most primordial aspects of an Egyptian motion, an Egyptian African motion, is that wisdom is the ability to go through all of the gates that belong together in an order, in a set. And that if one does this, that then opens those gates for you all the way through to the other side, in such a way that once you have done that once, you have done it forever. Because you never again will be stopped by the primordial series of gates that would stop you. And that the key is the ability to use language to open those gates and pass through. For the Egyptian wisdom, the land of the blessed was in the west, which in Egypt means the desert. It is in the west that one finds this quality of the beyond this world life, and that wisdom is meant as a tradition to give us the exact way in which to move ourselves through the series of gates with the right language, because each gate has a gatekeeper who must hear you deliver the appropriate sacred language at that particular juncture. Otherwise, you are stopped from going through. One of the earliest traces that we have of this kind of emotion comes from about 35,000 years ago on the southern coast of France, near big port of Marseille, there is a cave that now is over 130 feet below the sea level. It's so long ago that the Mediterranean has shifted its depth to that extent. And in that cave, perilously explored by French divers, was found a series of steps, a series of gates, which those coming into that cave were led through, and the clusters of the images on the cave walls and the arrangement of them in such a fashion that if one went through the entire cycle of that, you would be able to emerge from that cave into the light of day with an expanded visionary consciousness. And in this way, Homo sapiens sapiens taught themselves how to be wise about being wise. They were not just tool makers who could speak, but they were creative tool makers who could speak poetically. And so a wisdom tradition is always the ability to go through the sets. The making of a 13-part dialogue set at the end of the 1st century AD in Alexandria was the way in which to present a resonant set that could be expanded, and that the first expansion of that is to consider that 13-part presentation a season. And that if you put 4 seasons together, you would have a year. But instead of it just being a natural year, you would carry through the natural year the dimension of consciousness with you. And so having lived a conscious year, you would have transformed nature through the 4 seasons. And so the 4 seasons now make an annual circuit, ambit, by which all of the actions, the ritual actions that one was carrying through, have been informed, have been transformed, have been given an ability to expand, so that if you were able then to develop not only a quality of carrying consciousness through, but of having the mind so that it was able to reflect upon what you had done. The reflection would be, in effect, the other side of having gone through that complete cycle. So that the second year would be a going back reflectively through that cycle, not only with your consciousness, but with the mind's symbolic reflection. And the ability to express the mind's capacity for symbolic reflection, written language was created. The first cycle was an oral language. The second cycle, which was a complement to it, was a written language. So that this pattern of going through an ambit, a circle, and then having a change where one went back through that circle in a reflective way was almost like the mirror complement to the original. The Greek word for this particular form was chorea, out of which we get chorus, out of which we get the movement, the sacred movement of the primordial wisdom dance, the dance of life. And that is that there is a turning point. The Greek term for it was metanoia. There is a turning point in the mind where the reflection is no longer a reflection just of things in the world, actions ritually done in the world, but the reflection is an informed reflection that carries the field of consciousness, the theoria, the contemplative dimension, and puts it into motion in the aspect where one now is able not only to reflect consciously, but to reflect upon the reflection itself, and hence the double sapience. So that one can train oneself, and our kind, our species, has trained themselves for about 50,000 years in this technique. The metanoia, the turning point, when one does this in a deep motion, that African wisdom rhythmic motion, there is the turning which becomes then a pivoting. It's not just a point where one turns, but the turning itself becomes pivoting. So that the nature of a refined, reflective mind is that it is able to carry the pivoting rhythm as another dimension, not just the field of consciousness, but the way in which the body and the mind now are a constant, pivotal capability, which lends a further dimension that would not have ever been discovered before, and that is that there is another dimension very similar to consciousness, and that is historical consciousness. And so the emergence of history is an extraordinary discovery. And wisdom traditions always then make sure that in the teaching of it, in the learning of it, that one learns the lineage, one learns the tradition, and one learns that you yourself have an ongoing learning tradition. And so the Pythagorean way of reflecting was to do an exercise just before you go to sleep each night, to go back through the events of the day, but not to go back through the events of the day forward, but to go back retrospectively, so that you train yourself to go to sleep with a yoga of reflecting each day back through its sequence of events and actions. And that when you got up in the morning, when you woke, the very first thing that you would do was you would begin the day anew. Because it's not only that the turning point, the metanoia, is a transform of mind and becomes a pivot, so that at the end of the day, that moment when you go to sleep is the same moment as the turning. And when you begin a day, that beginning is the same moment as the turning. So that the ancient Greek chorea was that you have a movement that just begins and goes full circle and then turns and goes back on itself, back the other way. And when it comes to its completeness, the completeness is not an end, but it is a presence. So that one begins with the presence, goes through the circuit of the day, has a metanoia carried all the way through that circle of the day, and that at the end of the day, there's also a presence. And so the quality before the beginning, after the end, and at the pivotal middle all the way through it is a quality of presence, which is overseen by a spiritual teacher, by a spiritual messenger. And in ancient Judaism, it's called the angel of the presence of God. It is the angel of the presence that is this Hermetic teacher, this ancient way, this quality. The pivot in that Hermetic teaching was from a deep in Africa. The first Hermes, Thoth, is very much a Nile Valley presence from Abydos to Heliopolis and on from there. The third Hermes, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest, is definitely Alexandrian, Greek and Egyptian and Jewish together, the three braided together. But the second Hermes was the good spirit, Agatho Daemon, and that second Hermes was the black African wisdom that is in the pacing rhythm of the way in which a dynamic carries itself not by the steps, but through the steps, carries the wind of the spirit of the dance, which is an aesthetic dimension, which is the art of moving. And when one moves through the series of the gates, one's language has this wind of spirit presence quality to it. It becomes poetic. And the poetry has its own rhythm, so that poetry is always not in words, but in phrases. And that the phrases, if they continue to tumble together, they now have a quality of a song. And it is the ability to have a poetic that is able to sing its song without end that delivers one finally into what was called in the wisdom tradition eternity. What do the trillions upon gazillions of celestial beings do? They sing continuously. The phrase in the book of Job, it's a time when the morning stars sing together. That's always the time of moments of presence. One hears that singing, and one of the great Hermetic treatises was the 8th reveals the 9th. Once one has gone through a series, an octave of 8 phases, gone through 8 gates in such a way that the movement through each of the 8 gates itself is a continuity, then one has actually done something which is extraordinary. You have gone through 8 in a way of having 4 seasons in a natural way, the pivot, 4 seasons in a reflective way, consciously, and each time one has the movement from phase to phase. There is a moment of presence, and all those moments of presence are akin to the beginning moment of presence and the so-called final moment of presence. And when they're all put together, you have a quality of 16. So that the most sophisticated meditator, yogi on the planet was the historical Buddha, who was able to refine to a single moment of thought, the citta. And each citta has 16 parts. It has 8 parts that can be discursively quantized, but the other 8 parts can never be separated. They occur, the famous way of expressing it that I've used for 40 years is they occur as a trill. It is a musical trill which only is there because when one pronounces language orally in the right way, the aspirants of the pronunciation and the articulation are the trill that carries all the way through it. So that singing is the strongest way of speaking, and that strongest way of speaking has its own transform in the strongest way of reading. And the strongest way of reading is by the composition of the letters so that they make not only words, but that the words are fertile. They're able to come together with each other in phrases so that a poetry moves by phrases in the written way, by letting consciousness carry through the letters immediately into the words, carry through the words immediately into the phrases, and that one then can read in such a way that you make pictures, not in your mind, but you make pictures out of the field of consciousness. And when you do so, the pictures occur not in the individual mind, they occur in a presencing person who has learned to read and read the story. The discovery that one could take a moving picture and show it over and over again so that one could learn to read not only the words but the pictures together is the combination that is there in comic books. And it is the American comic books that really shine as one of the great triumphs of our wisdom, heritage, and tradition. There is a early quality to comic books which is extraordinary. If you look at comics from 1943, you'll find something like this, Donald Duck and the Mummy's Ring. By 1943, Donald Duck is not just a cartoon character, but is going on a wisdom adventure that goes all the way back to the Mummy's Ring in 1943 is exactly the time that someone writing a huge fairy tale like Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, is working on Lord of the Rings. The drawers of Donald Duck, Carl Barks, and the Walt Disney Studios did not know of Tolkien. But there is a synergy, as we used to say. There is a gestalt. Another aspect is 1944, the classics comics version of James Fenimore Cooper's The Pathfinder. So that classic comics, at the same time that cartoon characters for children are undergoing a wisdom tradition of adventuring, not just in the present, but going into the past. Going into the past in such a way that one can now read the classic comics version of the Pathfinder. And all of this comes to a deep culmination. This is 1947, Flash Gordon. By 1947, you have a peculiar quality in Hermetic America, the ability to put a written language in such a dynamic with the moving pictures that one now is able to understand that the comic is a written form, pictures and words, of the motion picture. And the motion picture, the American motion picture in particular, is one of the glories of world civilization. One of the earliest visits of H.G. Wells was here to Los Angeles, to Studio City. This is taken in 1915. This is Carl Laemmle with H.G. Wells, 1915. We have been also taking a look at the way in which the frontier is the movement over the American landscape that became a series of wisdom gates by which we were able to go through and refine and mature ourselves to a new level of species, to a new level of civilization. And the quality of this Western movement is brought to a great focus in The Big Trail, 1930, Raoul Walsh. It's the first time 19-year-old John Wayne is on the silver screen, 19 years old. The Big Trail is this enormous epic that was preceded the year previously, 1929, by the other great Western American star, Gary Cooper, in The Virginian, which is not about Virginia. It's about the Virginian, the man born in Virginia who now lives in the West, in the American West, and carries with him the American frontier ethos, just like in The Big Trail with John Wayne, that this ethos is somehow brought to a focus that if we go through movies like The Virginian and The Big Trail with a conscious capacity, and then go back through them retrospectively in a reflective capacity, we are training ourselves, we are teaching ourselves an ancient tradition that goes back to Paleolithic art in caves 40,000 years ago. This quality requires for us not just simply to see a flick, but to go consciously through it several times, reflectively back through it, and out of this comes a sense then of carrying your consciousness in a dynamic, pivotal way through the now not just natural experience, but the artistic experience. And in this way, the artistic experience is like a prism which delivers the full spectrum of possibilities that literally, if one did not check them, they would go into infinity, infinite possibilities. It's the same way as in the math of quantum physics. When Heisenberg's way of doing quantum physics and Schrödinger's wave mechanics way of doing quantum mechanics was put together, the problem was that by the early 1940s, one could do the math, but what came out of it were constant infinities. So that you had to have a way of stopping the integral from going through the transform into infinities. And the figure who found a new hieroglyphic way of doing this was Richard Feynman. And Feynman's diagrams are exactly the way in which one can have a refined integral that still is open to go into infinities, but you don't need to go into infinities. You go to as refined a decimal pointillism as you need. How many decimals do you need? 99.999. You don't have to go all the way to the end. One can round it off in such a way that the math will carry into infinity, but the practicality of its application goes to as much refinement as you need, and that's enough. It'll stop there. It will work there. We're going to take a little break, but I want to just bring two qualities into our focus. This is a book by Henry Nash Smith, Virgin Land, the American West as Symbol and Myth. And we're going to come back to that. And the second book is Wilderness and the American Mind, published by Yale University. Wilderness was the basic ingredient of American civilization. From the raw materials of the physical wilderness, Americans built a civilization. With the idea or symbol of wilderness, they sought to give that civilization identity and meaning. This is the changing conception of the wilderness. And as we have seen, one of the great changing conceptions is the development in American science fiction exactly at the time in which consciousness was learning how to Pythagoreanize films and writings. American science fiction began to have visionary capacities that rivaled that of the Old Testament prophets. We'll come back to this after our break. Let's come back to our braiding of themes. Braiding of the westward frontier movement of American history in a Hermetic wisdom mode of refining oneself by going through the gates, so that one literally goes from sea to shining sea. But as we will see, the sea to shining sea goes on, and the further extension, if one stayed on the globe, would be one goes from sea, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean to Asia. But one can also go from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean up to the ocean of space. But if one goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean to the ocean of space, one can also go to the ocean of space from the Atlantic Ocean. So the two launch sites for Hermetic American space exploration are Cape Kennedy on the Atlantic Ocean and Vandenberg on the Pacific Ocean. But the center of the space program, in the terms of the pivot, is in the deserts of the United States. From the Mojave Desert with the Edwards Air Force Base to the Nevada deserts of Area 51 to the Arizona deserts to the New Mexico deserts. It is in the deserts of the western United States that one finds the braiding of cowboys, Indians, and pioneers together with a new technological exploration, a new cosmological exploration. This cover of the March 1941 issue of Astounding Science Fiction has the most famous science fiction short story ever written by young Isaac Asimov. It's called Nightfall. And the quotation at the beginning, if the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God? It's a quotation from Emerson. So young Asimov used the quotation from Emerson, and the cover, drawn by Hubert Rogers, one of the great science fiction cover illustrators of the day, was taken from this sketch of the projected 200-inch telescope. This sketch was made in 1939. The actual building of Mount Palomar's 200-inch on its inaugural day showed an even more impressive actuality to it. The sketch of 1939 became the architecture of 1948. I happened as a boy to be living in Los Angeles area in 1948. And remember very much the stir that the opening of Mount Palomar created at the time. The blending of science fiction with Westerns is a famous kind of equality. And when Galaxy Science Fiction magazine came out in October 1950 with its first edition, the back says, "You'll never see it in Galaxy." Jets blasting, Bat Durston came screeching down through the atmosphere of Bazambages, a tiny planet 7 billion light years from Sol. He cut out his super hyperdrive for the landing, and at this point, a tall, lean spaceman stepped out of the full assembly, etc., etc., etc. Sound alike because next to it is a Western pulp description of the same thing. They should. One is merely a Western transplanted to some alien and impossible planet. You will never find this in Galaxy. This is mature. What is peculiar is that one of the most significant of all Hermetic American writers was Leigh Brackett, who combined science fiction and the Western in her one person. She learned screenwriting in the most impossible way. She was tapped by one of the most brilliant filmmakers, perhaps the greatest filmmaker in the world, Howard Hawks. She was a young Southern California girl, used to going to the beach, but loved writing, and somehow wrote a mystery novel. And Howard Hawks happened to pick up a copy and read it and directed his staff to go and find her. He wanted someone like this to write a screenplay, and he had two other writers for the screenplay. He had a professional script doctor named Jules Furthman, but he also had his favorite and most famous screenwriter, William Faulkner. But to keep Faulkner from being soured by Jules Furthman's over-editing corrections, and thus crimping the Faulkner style, Hawks, being a very smart Hermetic American, brought in a resolving third. He brought in a very bright, and he hoped very lively, young woman, Leigh Brackett. And so they collaborated, and the three of them wrote the screenplay for The Big Sleep. So she broke into films, learning that with Faulkner, you have a world-class major writer, perhaps the most major writer in the world at the time. And also that you have to be meticulous and learn the craft, which Furthman provided. And at the same time, there is another you have to keep track of, and that is the director, especially when he is a great director like Howard Hawks. So she learned to balance herself. And what was interesting was that she was not really a mystery writer, she was a science fiction writer. Now, the screenplay for The Big Sleep was done in 1944, but it wasn't released until 1946. And in 1946, she was featured on the cover of Planet Stories, Lorelei of the Red Mist, and she brought in a young writer named Ray Bradbury to co-author with her. She was like, she had learned from Faulkner. She had learned that you learn best when you teach someone else. And so she was the mentor for Ray Bradbury. And the interior illustrations, Lorelei of the Red Mist, show typical 1940s science fiction pulp material. And out of this the next issue of Planet Stories had The Million Year Picnic by Ray Bradbury solo, and this became the last section, the last part of the Martian Chronicles published in 1950. All of this was extraordinary because Lee Brackett was chosen again by Howard Hawks to do the screenplay in Africa, this time with John Wayne, not as a Western, but as a Western transposed to the Serengeti Plains of Africa. And she did a fantastic job on the screenplay of Hatari. And so it got Hawks to thinking that he had a most propitious moment available to him. He had the right screenwriter. He had the right themes. He had already paired up with The Big Trail with John Wayne by bringing John Wayne into the greatest Western epic ever made, Red River, which was made in 1948. And so Hawks got to thinking, I'm going to use Lee Brackett and John Wayne, and we're going to make a great Western that brings all of the elements of a Western together in one single story that will be enormously complex in the sense of it folding its themes like Japanese origami. And that film was made in 1958. It's called Rio Bravo. Not only John Wayne, but he brought in Dean Martin. He brought in Ricky Nelson. He brought in Walter Brennan. So he had this all-star cast, and Rio Bravo has become one of the great classic films, 1958. They put out editions now where you get the screenplay and the film in various versions. But he wasn't finished yet. He took Lee Brackett's screenplay of Rio Bravo, and he rearranged the characters and the plot line, the storyline, so that it was similar, but it came out completely different, and the film was called El Dorado. This time, bringing in Robert Mitchum instead of Dean Martin, bringing in several other actors, but it was still Lee Brackett who took this screenplay, the prize winner, and readjusted it so it became El Dorado. And then, in order to make a trilogy out of it, they took the same screenplay and rearranged it a second time, and it came out as Rio Lobo. This time, the punchline all the way through the film is an older John Wayne. This is 1970. He had been in films for 40 years. He had been the prize young Westerner leading the big trail, leading the wagon train and all of the pioneers from St. Joseph, Missouri, all the way to the Oregon Territory. In Rio Bravo, the reoccurring phrase all the way through, he's now an aging icon. He has young women constantly who relate to him not as the romantic man, but as one of the actresses who has snuggled up to his sleeping bag. And when John Wayne wakes up, he says, "Why did you choose me? There's this younger guy over there." She says, "You're comfortable." So all the way through, the young women relate to him in a complex way that eventually comes back to that punchline, "You're comfortable." And the very last phrase of the film, Sherry Lansing, who became head of a studio here, Paramount in Los Angeles, starts to deliver the line, and John Wayne says, "Please don't call me comfortable." So it is a quality of Hermetic America frontiers, not only going west, but going into the incredible universe of science fiction. And the very last screenplay that Lee Brackett did, she passed on just a few months after finishing it, was The Empire Strikes Back. The follow-up to Star Wars that not only equaled the genius of Star Wars, but to many consider the screenplay of The Empire Strikes Back is one of the most exemplary screenplays, comparable to Casablanca and Big Sleep. And it is this quality of science fiction and of the Western braiding together with a mystery story tinge that gives to American civilization a quality that is emulated everywhere else on the planet. One has the French New Wave, Truffaut and Godard trying to do their versions of these things. The great French science fiction detective story is Alphaville. All of this is traceable to a curious hiatus. From 1925 to 1936, there were at least 10 great science fiction films. The first of them was Arthur Conan Doyle's The Lost World, of finding prehistoric dinosaurs on a plateau top in hidden Africa, and followed the next year by Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and also a couple of years later, Lang's Woman of the Moon, Dracula, King Kong, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Island of Lost Souls, Charles Laughton's screen debut with the Wells, the story about Dr. Moreau, The Island of Dr. Moreau, Things to Come, and H.G. Wells, and also H. Rider Haggard's She. Then there was a hiatus of 14 years, from 1936 to 1950, where no great science fiction films were made, which is curious because from 1936 to 1950 is the golden age of science fiction. But it was the golden age of science fiction in pulp magazines, in the kind of publication that Astounding became the head of. And it wasn't until 1950 that all of a sudden the gates burst, the barrier burst, and the film that did this was Howard Hawks again doing a science fiction film, The Thing. And The Thing burst the gates so that in 1951 you had 5 great science fiction films in the year. The most famous of them, of course, is The Day That the Earth Stood Still, directed here by Robert Wise, a story about, it is the robot who is the powerful one, and the human is just the emissary. The original story by Harry Bates was called Farewell to the Master. And it turned out that the robot was not only more powerful, but also endowed with more universal intelligence and capacity. The other films, 1951, based themselves on the way in which, in 1950, a film released called Destination Moon was by Robert Heinlein. And this was to be the beginning of a whole new quality of films, that they would, science fiction films would have a veracity to them. And it was at this time that you began to find a lot of paperbacks coming out that had things to do with the moon in retitlement. This is by Lee Brackett's husband, Edmund Hamilton, Beyond the Moon, 1951. The original title was The Starmen. And so you kept finding things that related to planets, to the moon and to the planets. Mission Interplanetary is actually about an exploration of the galactic stretches. Thousands of light years, not just planets. And one found that in this, the most conspicuous figure that came out was Robert Heinlein. The first paperback to feature him was The Man Who Sold the Moon. The next one, The Day After Tomorrow. The third, The Green Hills of Earth, all about the moon and the way in which the difficulties of pioneers going to the moon is going to be extraordinary. And then he edited Tomorrow the Stars. So that you begin to get a pattern of the moon being the first gate out of the maturation cycle for a new wilderness, a new virgin land. And that is the American pioneering quality that leads into the exploration of the hidden capacities that the land will bring out of the spirit of man. And this is the theme enunciated very clearly in the Big Trail. In this case, the Big Trail leads to the moon. And it is in Hermetic America that one finds that the moon is viewed as the gateway to the beyond, and that the first beyond, the next gate, will be Mars. And that Mars will reveal, like the moon will reveal, hidden capacities of our species that were not only not evident before, they were not there before, they will be freshly and newly created. And so Mars became the theme in 1949 for Robert Heinlein to write what he called a young adult novel, meant to be read by those teenagers who were going to grow up in a world where they would get to do what they had read about as teenagers. They would get to actually do this as mature people. Red Planet takes place on Mars, and in fact, it's A Colonial Boy on Mars is the subtitle. And the colonial boy on Mars has to go around in interesting zebra-like spacesuits, but he has a pet named Willis, who's a Martian, and can curl himself up into a ball. But Willis also is the product of a very sophisticated, very ancient, millions of years old civilization. And so Willis helps a couple of young American colonial boys realize that the company, the corporation, is trying to take over the whole planet, just as they had taken over a great deal of Earth, and that in order to forestall this, they had to bring this information all the way across a trek across Mars to go to personally deliver the evidence to the colonists' committee, that they could not use any other means except to make their trek across the Martian landscape to do this. The British first edition looks somewhat like this in its cover. This was 1949. 12 years later, Heinlein took the same story and turned it inside out. It's not about colonial Earth boys on Mars, but it is about a Earthman raised on Mars by ancient Martian wisdom who comes back to Earth. And Stranger in a Strange Land is Red Planet. On the other side, this is the way in which the cycle goes in nature. This is the way in which the cycle goes the other way in reflection. And one of the famous words, it's now in American and English usage, grok, comes from this. one learns to share the present in its qualities with each other. And Stranger in a Strange Land, when it came out in 1961, was beginning to be read by science fiction people. 5 years later, by 1966, it was, along with Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the favorite reading of the 60s, of that whole decade, of that whole generation. And in order to reprise the moon theme, Heinlein brought out in 1966 one of his most interesting novels, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, about the way in which going through these experiences, moon, planet by planet, moon by moon, the star system will mature us and bring out qualities in us that were never there before. It's like adding the cut to the gem and turning it into a jewel. And that these different facets are turning Homo sapiens sapiens into a new jewel being that will be there. And when that new jewel being is there, it will be a jewel being that is shareable by the entire species. That man will have transformed his species by the time we will have gone through the star system. That the 8 major planets of the star system are like the 8 ancient gates of the octave, and that the moons and the asteroids and all of the comets and all of the other details are like the background, and that all of this prepares us to go into other star systems along the interstellar frontier. And the last great film from the 1950 to 1956, there were 14 great science fiction films in 6 years. The last one was Forbidden Planet. And Forbidden Planet is about going to another star system in such a way as one has to come up against the incredible possibility that the unconscious levels are not just limited to our species, but that our species on the unconscious level may share that unconsciousness with other species, in which case we have an extraordinary adventure ahead of us. We will have to learn to deal not just with our subconscious, but with the subconsciousness of all species, no matter where they are in the universe. It may be the same subconscious. And so Forbidden Planet, after 50 years, was put out in a special boxed edition, because these are timeless qualities. They're not myths. They are fairy tales of a future history. They are fairy tales visionarily, but they are about history carrying into the future. And it is Heinlein who first began to develop the theme. And The Man Who Sold the Moon, all of the stories in it, The Green Hills of Earth, and all the stories in this, and 6 other collections, all those stories together are what Heinlein called the future history. He outlined by 1941 what the future history was going to look like, and then methodically over the years wrote the stories to fill in that future history. In the future history, he comes to understand that more and more our capacities to mature will reach a threshold where for the first time we will have not a culture jammed against culture, kind of a pastiche so-called civilization, but that we will have achieved in the 21st century the first mature civilization. But in order to do this, there will be a hiatus of 50 years of no space travel. Our last visit to the moon was 1972. So by 2022, the 50 years will be up. And it begins to look like Heinlein wrote, almost like an Old Testament prophet, of having seen how this works out. One of the great difficulties is that in order to have a star system civilization, one is also going to have a new refined species of mankind. The last time that there were two different qualities between species was Homo neanderthal and Homo sapiens that shared the planet, shared the qualities of the land and the game and the landscapes for more than 175,000 years. There was no problem of having multiple species at the same time. But when Homo sapiens sapiens came into play 50,000 years ago, they began to understand that there had to be an excerpting of the way in which they matured from just the natural way. And so it was to take the young underground into the caves where the art was put, where the early sculpture was put, arranged in such a way that those young people brought in there, in the dark, would be able to take with them a handheld light. That handheld light were the early forms of candles that were little clay vessels that fit in the palm of the hand and had a hole, and you would put animal fat in that, and you could strike with flints and light that. And we have found hundreds and hundreds of these lamps. It's the only source of light in Paleolithic caves. So that when you came upon cave art, it wasn't that you saw the whole thing at once. What you saw was what the handheld light could illuminate in the vis-a-vis presence. And as you moved through the choreography of the cave, one would come upon image after image, symbol after symbol, in an arranged way. And one would not just do this once, but one would be put through in some kind of a cycle, like an annual cycle, all the way through your maturation years. And then when you would come to certain aspects of your life later on, you would go back and revisit this again, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 15 years, maybe when you had children each time, that you would be able to go through this. The greatest of these Paleolithic initiation caves is Lascaux, found in 1940. The quality of Lascaux is such that if you get a key at the beginning, you are able to understand eventually, after you have cycled yourself through, that this is the guide, that the painter of all of these is not just a painter, but that all of the painters who would have painted are of a prismatic personality. And the prismatic personality of Lascaux is symbolized by a black stallion with the head and the neck. And it is Black Stallion who 20,000 years ago painted Lascaux, was the Hermes. And Hermes in the Greek mythological is a psychopomp. He's the guide of the souls through the netherworld. This is going into the netherworld with a guide while you are still in life, so that when you emerge from the cave, you emerge now with the initiation having taken you through, and that initiation being held by the light that you yourself carry in your hand, and what is preserved in one of the finest spirit guide ceremonies in the world that's still here is Tiantai Buddhist practice in Japan, where a pair of young meditators will go through in one single night a series of 100 sites that they must visit together and do a gasho together. And one has to be disciplined in order to be able to complete this before dawn. Complete it as dawn comes up. I, in Canada, was very close to a Buddhist reverend named Sus Ikuta. And Reverend Ikuta had done this, and I got from him time and time again the exact pattern that he and his friend went through to do this and affect this. And he learned, for instance, how one can take impossible polarities in life and bring them into a synergy that gives you something completely new. This was in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. His congregation was split into a polarity. He had older Japanese traditionalists who were very rich and didn't much like the carefree younger Japanese who didn't want to have traditions. They wanted to be Western Canadians, which is very much like being Colorados, cowboys. We want to live a different life, but they were poor. So Reverend Ikuta got the older, richer people to pool their money to build a restaurant that would employ the younger people and give them a chance to mature there and make some money, and give the younger people a chance to do it their own way because they would be working together with no oversight from the elder people. And this turned out to be one of the most popular restaurants in Calgary in the early 1970s. When I came to Los Angeles in 1975 and began acquainting myself with the Buddhist community here, I ran across in Long Beach the Japanese minister who had been the companion of Sus Ikuta in this 100 circuit night. There they carried little lanterns, and it was only by the pair of them lighting with the pair of lanterns that you had enough light to be able to see the precarious path all the way through. A larger version of this, of course, is the great pilgrimage in the Vajrayana around Mount Kailas. It's about 25,000 feet, and it's one of these great rounded mountains, not a peak like Everest, but has almost like a massive dome, 25,000 feet up. And the ambit is around the base of Kailas, and it takes several days to do this. And where you begin is a lake that is a cold sapphire blue. It's called Lake Manaswar. And you begin at Lake Manaswar. You go for the days to go around Kailas and come back to the lake. What happens at the lake is it is almost always calm. At a certain moment, just before dawn, when one can see oneself in the reflection. The rest of the time, there are like breezes and winds that ripple, and it is no longer the magic mirror. James Fenimore Cooper's name for Lake Otsego was Glimmerglass, where he would look to get the themes for the Pathfinder, the Last of the Mohicans, and so forth. Like a scrying crystal. Lake Manaswar has several outlets. On the west, the outlet from the melting snows, which keep it almost always at the same level, but because there are a lot of melting snows off Kailas and the surrounding peaks, those rivulets become the great Indus River and the Sutlej River and the Ganges and the Yamuna River. And on the other side, that becomes the Brahmaputra. And those two river systems hold India like the arms of fertility of the goddess of the Himalayas, who looks down upon the plains where men live. And that bodhisattva's name is Avalokiteshvara. The quality of space, the quality of going through, the future history, the star system development will give us a refinement of our species exactly at the moment when we have a new mature civilization for the very first time. For the very first time in this star system. One of Isaac Asimov's great works is The Stars Like Dust. One of the dangers that he points out in the trilogy, they are called the Empire novels. One of the dangers is that as you build to the maturity of filling out the species capably, you also have the power, if not used with a differential integral complementarity, you will feed everything back into an integral form that becomes an empire mind, which crumples a civilization into a bludgeon for those who are not a part of it. One of the maturations in something like the Big Trail is that the Europeans who had become Americans going west learned, like the Pathfinder, that you can be a white Indian, that the land will mature you because it already has been matured by other mature species. So that as we go out on the interstellar frontier, to be able to recognize once again, we're not just reincarnated on the third rock from the sun. We're incarnated from trillions of worlds without end. We have an unlimited heritage. And it's only for convenience sake that we say we're terrestrial. Thank you very much.